Welcome into Outkick the Show. I am your fearless leader, Clay Travis. I hope wherever you are across this great nation, across this great land, you are having a fantastic Wednesday. We got a lot of fun to dive into here. The NFL kneelers have gone to war with Jay-Z. Odell Beckham Jr. Has an incredible quote about his Giants trading him to the Browns that kind of got lost in all the Baker Mayfield fracas from yesterday. Donald Trump tries to buy Greenland and then cancels a trip to Denmark as a result in one of the most incredible sequences of his presidency from a pure entertainment perspective. Jerry Jones and Ezekiel Elliott, battle of words as Jerry signs Jalen Smith to a long-term contract extension and continues not to do anything with Zeke, why I think he shouldn't sign Zeke at all. All that still to come, but first, this is, I think, an incredible story that is emblematic of what typically happens in revolutions. If you study the history of social movements or revolutions, eventually they move from having a target on the other side to internal battles based on everyone in one side trying to end up being more pure than somebody else. The best example of this is historically, that maybe some of you will know, the French Revolution. The French Revolution came about after the United States Revolution. They overthrow, I think it was Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and Robespierre is one of the leaders of the French Revolution. They have the guillotine brought out into the center of Paris. They are chopping the head of the aristocrats, of all of the landed gentry, of all of the kings and queens, all of them. And eventually the anger boils over and moves from a focus on the aristocrats and everybody else to the founders of the revolution themselves. And if you study it, it's a fascinating window into the challenges that come with revolutionary ideals. Now, if you know French history at all, eventually Napoleon swept in and took over all of France and became a dictator, an emperor, or whatever you want to call him. But he stepped into that void and provided order in amidst chaos, because the way the cycles work is these great ideals of the French Revolution rapidly gave up everything, and as a result, there was an absolute loss of everything kind of surrounding it. Okay, and so that was the storyline, really pretty phenomenally entertaining. All right, here is what's going on right now. We have a really interesting situation developing in the NFL. The NFL has basically said, okay, we need to make sure that we have an outreach to the aggrieved parties brought on by Colin Kaepernick. At this point in time, there are right now 2,880 NFL players under contract playing on the 32 NFL teams, 90 players per 32 NFL teams. There are two players that I'm aware of kneeling, one on the Carolina Panthers, one on the Miami Dolphins. Now, I want to dive into this issue because both of these players have ripped, I think there's only two kneelers left, whatever there is. Both of these players have ripped Jay-Z and called him a sellout, called him an opportunist, basically said all sorts of negativity associated with what Jay-Z is doing. The irony here is that calling Jay-Z a sellout is one of the more ridiculous things I have ever seen anyone try to allege, okay? Marcellus Wiley has a good piece up that I retweeted on Speak for Yourself. But Jay-Z is the epitome of a black capitalist, a man who grew from nothing into near billionaire status based entirely on his own wit, acumen, and talent, and has ascended to the level where he can contemplate potentially trying to buy a portion of an NFL team, maybe even a substantial portion of an NFL team. That's the very definition of inclusive capitalism. You open up your ranks to individuals like the NBA did with Michael Jordan, who have risen up the income ladder to a point where they can buy substantial equity in the larger league universe. And so to call him a sellout or criticize him is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen. But it's emblematic of what we saw in the French Revolution, where ultimately the revolutionaries turn on each other and argue over who is more pure. Now, Jay-Z hasn't fired back, really. He said we've moved past the point of kneeling. And he's saying that because he's interested in action. And this is an important point that I think gets lost a lot in our modern protest culture. The goal of protesting is not to protest. It is to change things through access to the political leaders or business leaders or people in positions of power who are capable of changing things. Okay? This is the essence of the civil rights protest if you are a student of history. The civil rights protesters were attempting to change the law. They wanted to be able to meet with the president. They wanted to have access to him. And this is why all this athlete activism to me is so ultimately stupid, because the primary goal of athlete activists like Megan Rapinoe or Colin Kaepernick or anyone else is actually not to advance any cause, and it's actually not to meet with people who actually may be able, through their power, to affect some change. It's actually to just get attention for protesting. Protesting is their brand. At this point in time, Colin Kaepernick doesn't really stand for anything. If he becomes a backup quarterback, he basically is worthless to all the woke community. They want him to be isolated, unable to make a living, so that they can use him as a symbol of protesting. The goal of a protest has to be accompanied by actionable results. And to me, Jay-Z seems focused on the actionable results. And if you also study history, you know that even in the civil rights movement, there was a disconnect between Martin Luther King Jr., who was frequently ridiculed by Black Panthers for being too connected to people in positions of power. If you study the civil rights movement, you will understand that one of the fractures that occurred in the wake of the laws that passed, and certainly the assassination of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but there was a radical, we don't want any kind of interaction whatsoever with white America, espoused to a large extent at times in his career by Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, and an integrationist ideal put forward by Martin Luther King Jr. in his march and speech at the Lincoln Memorial. Now, study this yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. But the point here is we're starting to see this in miniature, this battle over who is the most pure. And if you're trying to argue as an NFL player that is accepting millions of dollars from an NFL team to play a sport, and you are protesting in uniform, that you are somehow more pure than Jay-Z, who is also accepting millions of dollars to be involved in a capitalistic system, your argument doesn't make any sense. And in fact, it's going up in smoke. And so this is a story to follow along, and I want to give props to Brian Flores. You might actually remember Brian Flores in the social media mob universe. There was a tweet that went viral when the NFL coaches were being hired in the offseason. The Dolphins news of Brian Flores leaked, and I believe it was a big writer down in Dallas, Texas. I don't remember his name, but he came out and he immediately said, "Oh, Brian Flores is getting hired. What happened to black coaches getting hired in the NFL?" Turns out, plot twist, Brian Flores actually black. So a black writer in Texas was upset that Brian Flores was being hired, and he didn't even take the time to Google Brian Flores before he immediately assumed that he was Hispanic. That is what happens in the woke universe. It's incredible to see sometimes the way this happens when people so aggressively pursue a narrative, even if there's no basis in fact for it. Brian Flores, up from the bootstraps, worked for Bill Belichick for years, worked his way up, now the head coach of the Miami Dolphins. he is not a fan of Kenny Stills, his kneeling player, who said that Jay-Z was a sellout. So what did he do at practice yesterday? This is one of the all-time great power moves that's also funny. He began practice by playing 8 straight Jay-Z songs in a row. You want to talk about brushing your shoulders off? That, my friends, was a way to send a message about who is the real boss in Miami. That's absolutely hysterical. But think about this. The woke NFL universe is so broken that they have turned against Jay-Z. That's why I said this decision by the NFL was so brilliant. To bring in a guy like Jay-Z, you put the woke kneelers even more on an island of absurdity. Also, let me say this. Kenny Stills came out and he ripped the owner of the Miami Dolphins for having a fundraiser for Donald Trump. This is a crazy move. You are an employee. I employ people. Do you know what I would say if one of my employees raised an issue with my political opinions publicly? Deal with it. Do you know who pays your salary? This is crazy to me. I want to have a meeting with you as your employee to tell you why you're wrong on your political beliefs. Are we living in an upside down world? Imagine the reverse happen. Think about this just for a minute. Stephen Ross is the owner of the Miami Dolphins. Imagine that one of his players is saying political opinions or donating political dollars to a candidate that he disagrees with. Imagine the outrage that would ensue if Stephen Ross made that employee come into his office and lectured him about why his political beliefs were wrong. This would be the #1 story in America. NFL owner lectures player based on his political donations. Yet the player feels like he can lecture the owner who pays his salary, who puts food in his family's mouth, who puts food on their plates, who pays for their 401k, and this dude isn't even a very good player. He's not even a difference maker for the Miami Dolphins, which are an awful team. Now, it would get more attention if he decided to fire this dude, but think about the upside down universe we live in when saying that you have a different political opinion than a employee of yours is so controversial that the employee calls you out and then later says, you know what, I probably shouldn't have made a public statement. I probably should have just requested a meeting so that I could tell him that his opinions were wrong. What world are we living in? If you're going to be able to have a political opinion, everybody else is probably not going to agree with it, right? I say this all the time. The only person who you should agree with 100% on any issue is yourself. And even myself, I'm not sure if I agree 100% with all of my opinions. I'm open to changing them if I see better arguments to the contrary. But this idea that you're an employee and you're going to throw a fit because your boss is throwing a fundraiser for the freaking president of the United States, who he's known for decades? This is a wild, insane universe that we live in. But I just want to leave you with that final image. The NFL woke community has so spun out of control that they are being trolled by the playing of Jay-Z songs. They have managed to somehow isolate themselves to such an extent that they are calling the most successful black entertainer of their generation, a man who is beloved across all of black America, a sellout. Jay-Z, a sellout. Think about that for a minute. Go watch the Marcellus Wiley video that I tweeted out earlier. It's pretty entertaining. All right. This got snowed under in all of the absurdity of Baker Mayfield's Daniel Jones comments yesterday. And I want you guys to see this because I saw this quote and I was like, wait a minute, we totally missed this because we were so focused on everything that was going on with the Baker Mayfield talk yesterday with Daniel Jones. Odell Beckham told SI told Sports Illustrated he believes the trade was personal. He said yesterday, this came out, this is a quote from Odell Beckham Jr., who evidently is channeling Red from Shawshank Redemption. This wasn't no business move. This was personal. They thought they'd send me here to die. All right. This is absolutely insane. Odell Beckham Jr. was traded from the Giants to the Cleveland Browns. And immediately Odell Beckham Jr. turns into Red from Shawshank Redemption. Tell me this is not a quote that could have been said during Shawshank Redemption by Morgan Freeman's character. This wasn't no business move. This was personal. They thought they'd send me here to die. They didn't give you life in prison, Odell. They didn't put you in Fort Leavenworth. You weren't sent up the road to Shawshank. You instead were traded from one of 32 NFL teams to another of 32 NFL teams, and you're going to be paid $20 million a year to play football for a team that won more games last year than the one you played for. This is crazy talk. I'm telling you, I think that the whole Cleveland Browns experiment in 2019, which is going to be wildly entertaining to watch, is potentially going to be a complete and total dumpster fire. I have no idea what's going to happen, but I feel a lot like the Cleveland Browns in 2019 are the 2018 version of them was the San Francisco 49ers. Young quarterback beats a lot of bad teams down the stretch. Everybody gets insanely overhyped. Jimmy Garoppolo's banging porn stars in the offseason. Baker Mayfield's shotgunning beers. Everything is getting a ton of attention. And then I think the Browns are going to come out and fall completely on their face. That's what I'm starting to believe is going to happen. Baker Mayfield's been talking a ton. He beat one playoff team. Odell Beckham Jr. has been talking a ton. He hasn't been healthy in a season for a while. It's a lot like what happened with the 49ers last year. Remember all the hype coming in? San Francisco 49ers, Super Bowl contender. They were one of the hottest teams in the NFL last year, and then they just totally fell apart. And I think the team that is under the radar that is going to have a great season in their division is the Pittsburgh Steelers. They got rid of the Le'Veon Bell distraction. They got rid of the Antonio Brown distraction. Ben Roethlisberger, Mike Tomlin, Juju Smith-Schuster, all those guys are wanting to put together a show for everybody in the AFC North. When you got a two-time Super Bowl champ and he wants to come back and make a big-time statement, I think it could be a huge deal. I also think Eli Manning is going to be better than people anticipate because I think he wants to demonstrate. He's got Daniel Jones breathing down behind him, but I think he also wants to demonstrate that he's able to be successful without Odell Beckham Jr., which is crazy that he has to demonstrate because he already won 2 Super Bowls. Eli Manning has to be the most disrespected multi-Super Bowl champion in the history of the NFL. All right, this story is like it's out of Veep. It's like it's absolutely out of Veep. Donald Trump yesterday on Twitter canceled a trip to Denmark because he wanted to buy Greenland. The Wall Street Journal reports that Donald Trump is interested in buying Greenland. The Danish Prime Minister is like, Greenland's not for sale. And so yesterday afternoon, Donald Trump announced we're not going to Greenland. Now, this is an unbelievable story. You guys know I love Veep. I think it's one of the best shows that's ever been made, Veep. One of the funniest per-line shows, right up there with The Office, right up there with Seinfeld if you index it based on years. This is one of the greatest shows there's ever been, Veep. Absolutely hysterical. This is too crazy of an episode for Veep to have. One reason that I don't get upset with Trump is there are many reasons. One, the country is doing fine. Unemployment rate is at an all-time low for all races. The growth rate of the country is at a good place. We're near the all-time highs of the stock market. Income and wages are up. Things are not bad in this country, all right? There's a cottage industry in the media that needs to convince you that everything is awful. But if you look at every available data and metric point, things are actually going pretty well. So I'm not going to get worked up. I'm not a, grab my pearls and fall on the fainting couch kind of guy. But this is an incredible story, and it's indicative of the way I think you have to follow Donald Trump. If you just acknowledge that he's a bit of a cartoon character and that he runs the country like he is on a reality television show, it's a lot less alarming what's going on. Like, the tangible negativity associated with Donald Trump is tiny. He exists as the ultimate foil for the existing left-wing idea that the country's going to hell in a handbasket. And while I wish that Donald Trump was a more articulate version of himself, really, he's a natural response to the insanity that is coming out of the left wing. Most people who vote for Donald Trump don't necessarily support him, but they support him compared to the other options. And I think that's what people are missing about the 2020 election. Right now, they're like, oh, the Democrats are going to nominate so-and-so, and they're going to be... No. Ultimately, when it's Donald Trump compared to what might be a loony Democrat, I think he has a good chance of winning. Now, if they nominate Biden, we'll see, although Biden now is saying that Martin Luther King and RFK or whatever were assassinated in the 1970s. And he's making a lot of missteps and misspeaks, if you want to use that phrase, because guess what? He's old. I mean, it's crazy to me that we have 75-year-old people running to be president of the United States. To me, you should have to be like, you should be an age limit at the top. We have an age limit at the bottom, right? You have to be 35 years old in order to be the president of the United States. And the reason why we put that age limit in is we're like, hey, in the Constitution, we don't want somebody who's like 24 years old as the president of the United States, right? They need to be at least 35 years old, which back in the day, rising to the level of 35 years old was actually kind of middle-aged or an old man. Now 35 is not that old because the average person lives to be like 80. Back then, the average guy lived to be like 52, and so 35 years old was pretty old. Part of me wishes that the range for president was like you have to be 35 to 70, right? Or even 65. That's a big 30-year window where we could pick somebody to be president before they start to lose their faculties. The idea that we got two dudes that are going to be like 75 years old running against each other to be president of the United States, of course they're going to misspeak. I misspeak and I'm 40. By the time I'm 75, there's no telling what I'll say. So that's not necessarily a surprise, but if you watch Donald Trump from a cartoon-like character perspective and assume that his goals are not evil in nature, but that primarily his goals are to be an entertainer and try to do things that make the country more money, right? If you assume that his goals are to make the country more money and to entertain, the Trump administration is actually kind of entertaining. Now, I don't necessarily want that when we actually have major danger. Like, I would be not necessarily very pleased if we had another 9/11 and Donald Trump had to make all the decisions on the fly. That would be a little bit scary to me. But when everything is going well, like it is right now, I have no issues with Trump. This Greenland thing, to me, is just absolutely hysterical. It's outlandish. It's ridiculous. Maybe a little bit genius, honestly, because if you look at the opening up of the Arctic, it actually could make a lot of sense for us to buy Greenland to be able to use it as a strategic base of operations in our battle with Russia and with China. And when you really break it down over the Arctic opening up, when you really break it down, what is absolutely wild is everybody thought it was insane when I think Seward, William Seward, right? Wasn't he the Secretary of State at the time? When he bought Alaska, it's like the most brilliant decision that has been made in the last 100 years. All of the natural resources that we bought in Alaska, everyone ridiculed the idea. The idea, Seward's folly, they called it, right? When we bought Alaska, the idea was it was an insanely dumb decision. I actually think with all the natural resources that Greenland has and everything else, it actually might make a decent amount of sense, but for a lot of people, it just strikes them as crazy. Being willing to float ridiculous ideas is pretty intelligent. Yeah, the Louisiana Purchase was risky. And here, by the way, I always give people interesting ideas to write about. Here's an interesting idea. There's articles written about this. We have a place, down on the beach in the Florida Panhandle, right where the Gulf Coast is. Think about how much difference the trajectory of America would be if people in Alabama had not stupidly turned down the opportunity to buy the Florida Panhandle from Florida. Florida tried to sell. There's a big article about it. If you look at the state of Florida, you know, the Panhandle that extends out. Florida tried to sell to Alabama, and I think the Alabama legislature just had to ratify it or something, tried to sell all that area in Florida. If Alabama had bought that part of the country, then the 2000 election, George W. Bush loses to Al Gore. In 2016, Donald Trump would have lost to Hillary Clinton. 2 elections would have flipped just if the Panhandle wasn't in Florida. That's the strongest point of Republican base in Florida. And so it's pretty wild to think about that little geographic region, that little strip of land, how valuable it is, first of all. But also, if it were a part of Alabama, it would just be another part of a huge red state. Instead, it's oftentimes the swing area of the state of Florida. That's why they have that great line about Florida: the further north you go, the more south you get. Traditional south in Florida is North Florida, not South Florida. All right. Final thoughts. Jerry Jones. How about Jerry Jones? He made a joke about Zeke who, and Ezekiel Elliott said, "Oh, I'm offended by this," or his agent did, I guess. And then it continued to grow. And Jerry Jones came back and said, "I have the right to make jokes about Ezekiel Elliott if I want to." And what was interesting is the way Jerry Jones said it was twofold. One, I spent millions of dollars to defend you when the NFL unjustly suspended you for 6 games. And I fought Roger Goodell more aggressively than any other owner ever has over that decision to penalize. Secondly, it also sounded like Jerry Jones was basically saying to Ezekiel Elliott, hey, I know where the bodies are buried. And I think the decision to pay Jalen Smith was a big message that Jerry Jones was sending to Ezekiel Elliott. A lot of people, including me, have compared the holdout of Ezekiel Elliott with Emmitt Smith's holdout. The big difference is Emmitt Smith's contract was up. Emmitt Smith was not signed by the Dallas Cowboys when he did not play early in the season back in 1993. Ezekiel Elliott still has 2 years left on his deal. You know who doesn't have any years left on their deal? Dak Prescott's deal runs out at the end of this year. Amari Cooper's deal runs out at the end of this year. Jalen Smith just got signed. This is, I think, a great time for Jerry Jones to draw his foot in the sand and say, you know what, Zeke, you're just not worth that much. If you don't want to show up, we'll take the money that we owe to you and we'll roll it into other contracts for other people. You're a running back. You've already gotten paid $25 million. Dak Prescott only got $2.5 million. And as a result, I think that the storyline in general here, which is pretty straightforward, is Ezekiel Elliott, relative to his position, is way, way, way overpaid relative to what Dak has made. Yet Dak is showing up in practice, so is Amari Cooper, and so is Jalen Smith. I think Ezekiel Elliott is way overplaying his hand here. He's not worth much more than he's made. He's not worth much more than $8 or $9 million a year. And I think what is likely to happen is that Jerry Jones is going to continue to call his bluff. All right. I love all of you. I appreciate the time that you spend on this show. Lock It In is back. We'll be on at 4:30 Eastern, 3:30 Central, 2:30 Mountain, 1:30 Pacific. Go watch. My name is Clay Travis. This has been Outkick the Show. I'll be live tomorrow, 6 to 9 a.m. Eastern, as I always am on Outkick the Coverage. My new podcast is up. Podcast exclusive, Joel Klatt. If you're ready for college football, you'll love our conversation with Joel Klatt. And Rachel Bonnetta will be the guest next week. But I'll see you guys on FS1 in about an hour. DBAP, unless you need to SBAP. I'm Clay Travis. This has been Outkick the Show.